So I am McLean Bryant Macklin. I am the VP of Policy and Impact at Health Forward Foundation. Hopefully everybody in the room is somewhat aware of us and what we do, but we are a public health conversion foundation. And in this year, we are implementing our new strategic plan, which includes a focus on creating and supporting pathways to safe, quality, and affordable home ownership, which brings us to our interest in this conversation today. And is my mic working? Kind of? Okay. Our partnership with One Kansas City Radio on this discussion. So, hi, Tim. Just wanted to introduce him real quick. And so we wanted to round out Black History Month with a conversation around housing affordability and availability in the Black community. And so we assembled this powerhouse panel of Black women with experience in both community, connection with community, and also deep professional experience in this space. So just for a little bit of context, we often talk about education and entrepreneurship and the access to wealth and economic opportunity that they provide as the great equalizers in our community. But how do people even access, as that first step, college and the ability to start a small business? It's often through loans and leveraging against what has been the primary vehicle for wealth accumulation in this country, home ownership or land ownership. Homes and home ownership have always been that way for Americans to finance a better future, but it has been difficult for many people, particularly people in the Black community, to achieve. And so we wanted to have a conversation around housing and the historical context in this country, as well as sort of the current conditions and barriers, as well as some of the resources available and some of the tools and tactics that are being employed by the ladies on this panel to help to increase the availability of affordable housing in Kansas City. And so the dream, right? Access to safe, quality, affordable housing, a sanctuary, an area for peace of mind, getting together with your family, recreational activities outside, the ability to cook a healthy meal at home, and all of that lends to your health, right? And so that is Health Forward's interest in this, in that your housing conditions are one of the determinants of your health outcomes. All right, and so wanted to also provide just a little bit of context in terms of the data. I have included our policy agendas on the table. I totally underestimated the number of people that would be attending in person because we were offering this live stream and thought that most people would just, view us from the comfort of their desks. So I apologize that there's only one of each of our policy agendas on the table. But the agendas have a bunch of data on housing availability and affordability and wages and whatnot, and other data points relevant to Health Forward's work. But if you have an opportunity to peruse, I want to grab one just to get a sort of better contextualization of why we're having this conversation, although I would imagine most of the folks in this room are really well in tune with the issue. And so invite Q&A at the end of the conversation, or if there's something really poignant or a question that you have in the course of the discussion, please feel free to interject. All right, so some data. About 15.5% of all households in the Kansas City Metro make less than $25,000 annually, and only 12.3% of rental units are affordable to this income range, and that says nothing about the decency, accessibility, et cetera, of those lowest price units. And I'm gonna look at you because I wanna say thank you to our partners at LISC and Mark for helping to provide some of this data. In the Kansas City Metro, more than 2 out of every 5 renters are cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing. The median household income by county in the Kansas City Metro ranges from a low of $48,000 roughly in Wyandotte County to a high of $91,000 in Johnson County. Households in Johnson County have nearly double the income of those in neighboring Wyandotte County and therefore have the flexibility to pay nearly twice as much for housing. The numbers are even more upsetting and the disparities even more apparent when you look at the data by county or community and race. Statewide in Missouri, there is a shortage of almost 120,000 affordable and available rental units for renters earning extremely low incomes. 26% of renter households earned a household income of less than $26,000 per year, nearly $10,000 less than they would need to earn to afford a two-bedroom rental home at HUD's fair market rent. In Kansas, there's a shortage of about 51,000 affordable and available rental homes for renters earning extremely low incomes. 23% of renter households earn a household income of less than $26,000 a year, nearly $10,000 less than that HUD fair market rental. With Kansas City's deep history in housing, particularly in the Black community, there's a lot of areas for pride. So we talk about Sheraton Estates, the Santa Fe neighborhood, Citadel as a recent example of an area of pride for the development of historically Black communities where there is wealth and opportunity. But there's also been periods of that history that's been harmful when we think about redlining, white flight, loss of job centers to suburbs, 71 Highway, even the Brush Creek Beautification Project, and more recent gentrification. And the work of Mr. Gates and community builders and the organizations represented by these ladies are also examples of great work that is occurring and that can be modeled and should definitely be lifted up as examples of what we could each be doing to show up in our community. So I will introduce our panelists. The lady to my immediate left really needs no introduction. She is a legend in Kansas City, Ms. Margaret May. She is the former executive director of the Ivanhoe Neighborhood Council, a former city planning commissioner, a leader and innovator in housing sustainability and accessing resources and capital where there is a dearth and where people of color have faced barriers for generations, and so really eager to hear about the work that she has done in the Ivanhoe neighborhood. We also have Alicia Kennedy, who also needs no introduction, a former city councilwoman in Kansas City, Missouri, a lawyer, a TIF commissioner, and the current deputy director at the Neighborhood Legal Support Services. And she will talk about her work in policymaking in the housing space, as well as providing legal supports all around Kansas City, but specifically in the Likens neighborhood. And then we have Rachel Russell. To my far left, representing Wyandotte County, she is the Director of Community Engagement at Crosslines Community Outreach, which provides resources for people in the Kansas City area earning low wages and providing services and opportunities, including in the space of housing stabilization. And she's also a member of the KCK Public School Board. So I will move into questions. And just curious, and we can start with you, Ms. May. In your view, what is Kansas City's relationship with housing historically? And what are some examples of occurrences or context that you think created or contributed most to the state of affordable housing to date in Kansas City?
All right, I'm going to have to go back to history. When our schools were integrated in Kansas City back in the 1950s. Following right upon that, we started having an opportunity for people that lived in the part of the city that I grew up in and lived in, and that was north of 27th Street, to move beyond that. And as people that look like us sitting here at this table started to move into areas that were south of 27th Street, then of course the white people that were living there began to move out to the southern or northern parts of the city. And so that's where it all began. And I won't go beyond that right now because I could go on for half an hour, and I don't think you want to give me that much time.
I don't think we have that kind of time. All right, Alicia.
I guess I'll pick up. So after white flight, you have suburban sprawl. Redlining is a factor in that. 71 highway became an issue that divided the African American community, because as we moved south of 27th Street, we settled, primarily between 27th Street and maybe 63rd Street, and 71 highway cuts right through the middle of those communities. 75th Street is where I think Fairyland was, and because of segregation, we weren't really allowed that far south. And that wasn't that long ago in Kansas City. So when you talk about where we are today, you're only talking maybe 2 generations, 3 that maybe, but definitely like 2 generations. So over the last 60 years or so, we've seen this issue of the vestiges of racism in housing in Kansas City. So the white flight, the impact that it had on our school districts, the impact it's had on the investment in communities. I recently served on the city council. The part of Kansas City north of the river is the fastest growing part of the city now. South Kansas City is losing residents to the suburbs, Lee Summit and surrounding areas. And so now when we look at Kansas City and the makeup of its neighborhoods, the traditional neighborhoods in the core, are where you have seen in recent years where low-income families were in those zip codes. Now we're seeing with the revitalization of downtown, that's changing. And so those neighborhoods are now, downtown is now considered as far as south as 31st Street. Is considered in the downtown plan. And so those neighborhoods like Santa Fe and Washington Wheatley and those areas along Vine Street are now ideal areas that people are looking for investment opportunities along the Prospect Corridor. And so those investments that come in. So when we talk about affordability, now people are looking for affordability outside the core of Kansas City. And we're seeing it on the Wyandotte County side as well, where downtown is being revitalized and you're seeing people looking for affordability moving further south outside the core of the city, which impacts, again, the education of the school district. It impacts access to jobs, transportation, and a number of different things. And so I'm not sure that, this was some grand plan, but we are definitely dealing with the effects of the de facto segregation that's occurred in housing. Now, in the core of the city, it's hard-pressed to find anything decent to rent for less than $1,000 a month. And you heard the stats that McLean provided that, 15, 20% of the people are making less than $26,000 a year, and only 12% of the housing can accommodate that. So that means over 80% of the population can't afford the current housing stock. And so as we talk about the opportunities and plans to try to fill that need, we utilize incentives. I serve on the TIF Commission. We're looking at foundations and philanthropy to fill those gaps, but it's still not happening at a fast enough rate to be able to address the immediate need.
So Rachel, I'm gonna pivot to you, but I'm also going to incorporate some of the next question because Alicia hit on some of these points. But in Wyandotte County in particular, what are you seeing in terms of like the data and even the day-to-day lived experience of people with regard to housing accessibility?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. So I think in Wyandotte County, what we oftentimes see, or what we are seeing, is similar to the previous remarks given, is we see a lot of investment in the Legends area. We see a lot of investment in downtown because, believe it or not, you couldn't tell me that there is no story about the World Cup coming to Kansas City and that not being important, that our communities that intertwine in that intersection are not important to decision makers right now. So what that means is that those middle places in Wyandotte County, from the Legends to downtown, they continue to be disinvested in. We see our grocery stores closing. We see our parks being more run down. We see all of the things that draw people to communities not being present in that in those parts of town. And so for us, you either live on the outskirts or you look at living somewhere else in the Kansas City region. Also, access to affordable housing, both safe and affordable, are two words that oftentimes don't go together. So a lot of our families are having to choose between being in housing that they can actually pay for, that is 30% of their take-home income, or you see them living in conditions that are unsafe. And so I think for us, there really is no in between. There's no, oh, do I get to have this safe and affordable house, or do I just have one that's affordable? And is it truly affordable by meeting my needs? Do I have sidewalks that my kids can walk to? Do I have great schools? Do I have those things? Sometimes you are not, that opportunity to choose is not even there because you're just trying to make sure that you have somewhere to go in the evening time.
Thank you. So you are each doing critical work, often approaching the issues from different, sort of vantage points, perspectives, or entry points, or what have you. Just curious, what are some of, well, if you could sort of explain some of the work that you're doing in the housing space, the geography you're doing it in, and then some of the tools and tactics that you're employing to increase housing affordability and availability, or work that you had done, work that you spearheaded and led. And sort of what distinguishes your work from other work in the community, and how that has served to be beneficial. Ms. May.
Well, I think that the work that was done in Ivanhoe is a good example for neighborhoods, in that the people that lived in the neighborhood had an opportunity to get together and develop a plan. So they were blessed with a grant from the Kauffman Foundation, and they were able, over a 6-month time period, to develop the plan. And it had 5 parts to the plan. One of those was housing, economic development, and jobs. And all of those things, as have previously been mentioned, go hand in hand as far as being able to solve the housing problem. I could go on and on and on.
And I wouldn't mind if you did, and I, just to speak to, like, how you were able to finance a lot of the work that you did through Brownsfields or
Well,
other programs.
one of the important things, again, about people in the neighborhood coming together and having a plan is actually going to places like the city or the county or federal government, or to foundations, and being able to let those folks know that you have a plan and that the people that live there are engaged and involved. I think that's a real big key, because if you're just going and asking someone to come and do something, and you aren't doing anything noticeably yourself, then people aren't too inclined to go someplace to do something where the people that live there aren't involved. And I think that's the key, is getting the people there involved, and knowing how to go about getting funding. Is that enough, or do you want me to go further?
That's plenty, and I know your co-panelists will expound. Alicia, if you, or Rachel, either of you.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think in the space of the work that I do, let's talk about renters first. I think a big piece of our housing issue is landlord engagement. And so for us, whether it be the 400 folks who have housing choice vouchers in our community that don't have landlords that are willing to work with them, it is upon us to do the work to destigmatize what that means for our community. That means that we are leaving federal money on the table and saying our community doesn't want this money for those who are most vulnerable in our community to have access to housing. So for us, we are looking at a landlord risk mitigation fund, which has been used in numerous communities across the country, that has actually been proven successful. The great statistic around this fund is that those communities that have implemented it, oftentimes the fund goes unused. And so really it's just this caveat that, hey, here, should something happen, We will pay rent. We will pay you for the damages. We will have this resource available to you. However, what it really does is destigmatize the utilization of who uses vouchers. And if you put someone who has a voucher and someone who just is paying private rent, I'd be sure that you would see no difference. The stigma is real, and it is something we have to address, but we can also support both tenants and those who need that voucher or utilize that voucher in that way. Go ahead.
No, you finish.
The other thing that I would say related to home ownership is the concept of a community land trust. And so organizations or grassroots efforts can purchase land, and a homeowner can build property on the land. This work for our community in Wyandotte is led by Community Housing of Wyandotte County, CHWC, and it is really making home ownership available to those that it may have seen far distance or something not attainable for those in our community. And so from the Landlord Risk Mitigation Fund to the Community Land Trust, those are two opportunities that we have seen as an opportunity to address both things on the spectrum. And additionally, our government, local government, is working on their land bank policy. So Wyandotte County has 4,000 plus plots of land. Our local government should not have that much land. That is, the relationship with community and land should not be that deep when it comes to the local government. And so our commissioners and our departments are working on that work. And so I'm excited to see where that will take us in 2023.
I just wanted to add that in addition to reaching out to the people that live there to be involved, we actually reached out to the landlords and invited them to come to meetings and kept them in the communication link so that they would understand what was expected of them.
Yeah.
And that really, really helped. And the other partner that we had was Habitat for Humanity.
Yeah, I think you bring a really valid point, is I, as a social service provider, can't make decisions for the landlord. So it's important to have landlords at the table, at the decision-making process, because then our ideas will be more successful. It's important to have voucher users at the table when we're talking about what that looks like as well, because those are the folks who are the end user. And so we can't do any of this housing work without having all of the partners. And in Wyandotte County, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to do this work with the support of Health Forward Foundation through our Community Health Improvement Plan. And so safe and affordable housing is a health crisis, or as it was mentioned, is one of those social determinants of health if you do not have that. And so our health department has established a platform, but also has brought together many community partners, organizations, and those both funders, developers, community partners, and all of that to the table to be a part of this conversation to find solutions that are community driven.
Please, yeah.
So in addition, so I guess the initial inquiry was, what are we doing in this space now as it relates to housing? I am an attorney, former elected official in the city of Kansas City, chaired the housing committee, chaired the health department. And so all these things we're talking about now from a policy standpoint are all critical. So in addition to what Ms. May mentioned about having a plan, you also have to have capacity. So what was unique about Ivanhoe was that it had dedicated staff to execute the plan. That is extremely important. And like in the neighborhood that and let me kind of take a step back, I currently work for Neighborhood Legal Support, which is founded by Greg Lombardi, who's in the room today. Shout out to Greg, which has established a really innovative model of focused community development. That work encompasses a number of things that we're discussing right now. It's not just community building, which is extremely important. It's not just housing. It's focused community development. So it's identifying the assets in the community. How do we begin to build upon the successes, remove the negative elements, which in this situation, it's abandoned and blighted housing through litigation is the work that we do. to be able to improve quality of life for residents. And then at the same time, building capacity to be able to empower the residents on how to make their community more livable, how to be stronger advocates for the things that are needed, how to engage in the advocacy work that's needed to get funding. And so all those things are oftentimes high level and a very big ask of communities where there's a lot of need, where there may be low income, low education, and people are oftentimes overburdened with just the cares of life. And so if there's not capacity of dedicated professionals, not just caring community people, but dedicated professionals to be able to advance these initiatives, it oftentimes does not happen. And I think that sometimes we lose sight of that is a privilege. You know, the community we work in now in Likens is in Northeast. We had an issue with the school closure that was coming upon. There were a number of different organizations that had staff that were ready to respond and organize and mobilize community around that issue. I live on the east side. There were not as many organizations with dedicated staff to respond. And that was where the greatest impact was going to occur. And so oftentimes we see where there's a disparity of where the need is and where the funding is. And as it relates to housing, it's very much the same. And so oftentimes in the city of Kansas City, we're relying on the private sector to address the housing needs. The conversation at the high level is always around new construction, but that is not where the greatest need is. The greatest need is for these working families that are making less than $30,000 a year that have school-aged children that are looking for affordable housing, safe and affordable housing. And so they're being kind of shuffled around, displaced. And so how do we begin to meet those needs? New construction costs is cost prohibitive, one, to make them affordable without some kind of subsidies, and then just the time it's going to take to get us up to scale. So rehab is the best option, which is the focus of the initiative that we work through, is acquiring houses through the Abandoned Housing Act and Civil Nuisance Act, using state legislation to be able to acquire the properties from absentee owners or derelict property owners and get them in the hands of, through the courts, in the hands of rehabbers that are going to rehab the properties and make them safe and quality housing in the community. What that does is twofold. One, it removes the blight, and two, it stabilizes community. I think you cannot talk about affordability without having a conversation around ownership. Oftentimes in programs like ours, most of the owners are typically investors because they have the money to do the rehab work. There's ongoing conversation about how do we make a loan fund available for homeowners to be able to take advantage of this, to be able to stabilize communities that way, because affordability is subjective. It moves, it's very fluid. Rachel said on the Kansas side, they're struggling to have the conversation. On the Kansas City side, we've set a number that's unrealistic. And I think that, what I recall, the most recent numbers I recall was that the greatest need was like 3-bedroom housing for less than $1,000 a month. That doesn't exist in Kansas City today, that is safe and affordable in that same manner. And so, but there is an opportunity to do that when you're able to rehab a house through projects like ours. You're able to rehab a house for maybe less than $100,000. Even if you get a mortgage on it with current rates, it's still less than $1,000 a month. So those are opportunities to be able to move forward. And so how do we scale initiatives like this? With support from funders. We have had very good success at the model that has been implemented to be able to demonstrate how we can leverage a $100,000 investment to 20 units of housing, the acquisition of 20 units of housing. You can't do that with new construction. But then we also have to look at funding models that's going to be able to provide the funding for the rehab costs, patient capital that provide low or no interest mortgages, which is what Habitat provides, which helps make their housing affordable. So you have to layer all these things. So you have to have all these pieces. You have to have the planning, the policy, the right stakeholders advancing these initiatives to be able to get the funding. Oftentimes, Joe Investor asking may get nothing, even with a good plan, but Ms. May with Joe Investor may get a good response. And I think all those things come into play when we talk about how we begin to move things forward and begin to stabilize communities and to create additional housing stock within the city limits. Now, when you talk about suburban sprawl, that's very different because affordability is sometimes outside of the city limits. But then you have transportation challenges. of them being able to get access to work and other things like that. So I believe that as we have this conversation around housing, you have to look at education, you have to look at healthcare, you have to look at economic development, and I think there's an opportunity now where everybody's understanding the importance of housing first for us to have a collaborative conversation. And one thing I'd like to really reiterate is the importance of all that is having collaborative leadership at the helm, whether it's a nonprofit organization, a neighborhood organization, being collaborative. I don't believe Ivanhoe would have been as successful, as smart as Ms. May is, if she wasn't collaborative. Because Ivanhoe had need, but they didn't have resources. And they didn't have all the answers, and people who were willing to make investments, you had to figure out how you work and play together to be able to get the highest and best use and outcomes in those scenarios. And so I think that's probably one of the greatest examples that you provided, Ms. May, in your leadership to other neighborhood leaders that are here today. Because as leaders, we oftentimes, we know what we want and we know how we want it, but we also know what we need, and we have to be respectful and reciprocal in how we leverage these relationships and partnerships.
And the collaboration is so important.
So you each spoke to how complex this issue is, and how so many different factors impact housing availability, or housing availability impacts education, transportation needs, what have you. And thinking about, what changes we need to see systematically, right? Whether it's transit-oriented development or some other new approach to policymaking, or even how philanthropy or government shows up into the space. Any suggestions or things that you guys are tracking that are happening nationwide or in Kansas City that we should be aware of and maybe lean into?
Yeah, I think the place that I would start is source of income discrimination. That oftentimes is a huge defeat for individuals seeking housing, depending on where their income comes from, whether or not they can provide the documentation, whether that be in banking when they're pursuing home ownership, or it be with the rental mortgage, not a rental mortgage, a rental leasing company. Those oftentimes are barriers for folks to access home ownership or rental properties. And so for us, that is something we are paying attention to. That is on our commission's public policy agenda. And it is also something that we're paying attention to at the state level. I work alongside some of our leaders in Johnson County, as well as Douglas County. Douglas County is probably the furthest ahead in this work with their Human Services Commission, bringing up their policy for a vote late last fall. They're doing some edits now. That is really what we have been paying attention to, as well as putting our feet in the water here to see what political buy-in we have on our side as well.
Thank you. Alicia?
So at all levels, there was a forum maybe a month or so ago of the prior mayors, and Nick Haynes asked kind of what's the issue that you're surprised to see today that was an issue when you were mayor. This is Cleaver, so that was a long time ago. And he said housing. That was his issue on day one. It's his issue as he's chair of the Housing Committee now in Congress. So at the federal level, I mean, there are a number of different tools that obviously need to be deployed, CDBG and HUD funds, and how do we begin to pull down sufficient dollars at the city level, state level, city level, for us to be able to advance some of the initiatives that we have in our housing policies that are already codified, adopted at the city and at the state level. At the state level, we have to continue to look at the tax incentives, at the state and at the city level, at the tax incentives and how we're funding or incentivizing housing, and really defining what affordability is. I believe this discrimination in housing voucher is something we have to look at seriously. Even in communities that I work in now, where people are doing great work on rehabs and they're providing safe and otherwise affordable housing, but the people who live in those communities may not have access to them because they have a housing voucher. That's problematic. And I think that we also have to look at ways of providing additional funding. I said this earlier about making funds available for ownership options. I bought my first house at 18 in Kansas City. We had a very innovative housing department. HEDFC was in place. They had a program where you were able to get a 20, I think it was like an 80-20 And I got a 20% grant for the purchase of my home. It was a low-interest loan, and I had to go through a home buyer workshop. The underwriter at the time, I think it was HEDFC, they did non-conforming underwriting for the mortgage. I was 18, but I had been working full-time since I was 16. So I had the work history, I had the income, but I didn't have a traditional credit file. I had been paying rent in an apartment for over a year, so that was how I was approved. We don't have anything like that today. But I think that there are some, I mean, and particularly in the same neighborhood where my first apartment was at Armour and Truce, I paid $275 a month. Those apartments today are $1,000 a month. Now, that was 20-something years ago, but still, that's a big markup. And for somebody who's been written all that time, affordability is in the ownership path. And so we have to look at creating models for non-conforming persons, whether they be, working in the gig economy, or entrepreneurs, or people who are, may not be English speaking first. Some of our immigrant community, we see that in Likens where I'm at now. And so we have to find ways to provide more options there. The policy, we've got policy and plans on the shelves at every level. What we have to have is bold leaders that are going to advance those initiatives and be willing to, put some funding behind those things to make sure that we're able to see them through at all levels of government.
Well, I think also it's a matter of educating, informing the people that live in areas, particularly people of color and people that don't, that are lower income. There's so many things that may be available that people just aren't aware of. So I think it's just so important that we do our very, very best to inform people. And sometimes that means going to places where people are rather than expecting them to come to a meeting. Going to a church or going to a community center, maybe even going wherever people hang out and providing information, because if people don't know, then they're not going to do it.
Yeah. I will echo that. And just something that I've learned in the last year and a half, 18 months, is that folks who have housing vouchers also have a home ownership component to it. So it is not just the tenants that we need to be educating, or our community. It is also our housing authorities, or those who are at the decision-making tables, to know that they know what's available at the federal level, to be able to layer these things together, to say, hey, you've lived here for 3 years. Have you thought about converting this to this, and this is what that looks like? So that continual education piece is huge for many of us.
So we're at 3 o'clock. I just wanted to note that for anybody who was only planning to be here until then. We've got some more time, and I think our panelists have some more time if you all have more time. Wanted to turn it to the audience to see if you have questions or even comments or statements, or, yes, please.
I really want to speak to the residents who are there.
Yeah.
And, certainly we're interested in affordable housing and rehabbing the older houses, but the people who have lived there, who could not get financing to keep their houses up and are desperately wanting to stay where they are, because if they moved and sold their house, they couldn't afford to live anyplace else. There's a lot of conversation about bringing in new, fixing new, getting new homeowners, and it's all wonderful. There's very little support and help for those who are there and want to stay. Certainly CDBG comes around, but it's spread all over the city. So are there other programs? Now, I know 1% sales tax did that, and I am a champion for that, but they can't be alone. There has to be some other opportunities for homeowners to stay in their homes. Any suggestions?
Yeah, so I would say on our side, we in Waco, for individuals that live near the Quindaro ruins, this has become a conversation around the foreclosure and the when you fall behind on your taxes. So we need policy work around how do we keep people in their homes. We have the data that tells us that once folks are out their home, they have very limited options. And so there has to be work at the policy level, at the decision-making level, where we are keeping people, where we are doing that diversion work, especially for homeowners who, you know, have been in their homes. It's passed down generation to generation. But when we talk about fixed incomes, which I spend a lot of my time for seniors and for those who are on the street, having housing, the housing first model tells us that if they have housing first, then we can address all the other issues. But if they do not have housing, then we will struggle to do anything. And so I think what we saw on the Kansas side with the Kansas Homeowners Fund was an opportunity that we have to look at as a state, but also as individual communities of how do we expand that? How do we support that? That would be what I would have to add to that.
Well, it's very important to have a rehab program that provides repairs for homeowners. And of course, they have to qualify to be able to get those. And most of the time, people who live in those areas do qualify. But you need to have a program and actually set goals of how many houses that you're actually going to repair each year. You know, getting money to do all of them at the same time is probably very unlikely. But a lot can be done if you have a plan and you're actually doing some on an ongoing basis.
And just to add to that rehab, I think we have to quit calling minor home repair minor, because oftentimes none of it is minor. We have to identify those contractors that we can reach out to that will provide that support, that will not, oh, I'll squeeze you in after I finish this really big job. We as a community have to identify those folks, and we have to update those lists, and we have to have that information readily available, because oftentimes you'll get a call and it'll be like, hey, I need this done because I just got a code violation. And it's like, I don't have anyone to do it. Or the person I call is like, oh, I can do it in maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And I'm like, they don't have 2 or 3 weeks to wait for you to put it in. So yes, I 100% agree.
Well, and we also need to, part of the plan in Ivanhoe was to focus on actually getting minority contractors to do that work. Not, 100%, but, a majority of them would actually be people who actually likely lived in some other neighborhood or that neighborhood. And I think that's something we need to just make sure that we're looking broadly at what we're doing and trying to help the people where it's needed most.
So I'll give a couple of different examples. One is when I was on the council, that was a preventative measure that I was able to get incorporated. So those that had housing code violations, when they find themselves in housing court, many of them were seniors. And they end up in housing court. And so I was able to get funding for us to have a coordinator to work with those individuals, to proactively work with them on rehab projects to be able to debate the code violations. And so whether it was through the Love Thy Neighbor initiative that myself and Councilman Barnes led on, or it was through the Housing Trust Fund that we established when we were able to have a pool of money where we were able to contract with some of the CHODOs to be able to do some of that minor home repair work in those communities. Right now, those funds are very limited, and oftentimes they're targeted. CDBG dollars are usually targeted for certain neighborhoods, and CDBG is Community Block Development Grant dollars, the federal dollars. And those dollars have requirements on. You have to pay, certain wages and a number of limitations, or not limitations, but a number of additional requirements that don't allow those dollars to go as far as they could. And so having access to capital that is philanthropic in nature or patient in nature that will allow families to access those funds to get those repairs made in the form of grants or in loans. Again, I'll go back to having a product that is non-conforming. A lot of time our seniors, they're getting these loans, but they're predatory loans. the roofer comes and, you know, I mean, it's just crazy what happens in our communities because either they don't have knowledge or access to loan products that are not predatory. And so I think that when we talk about what the needs are, not just having the rehabber, having access to capital that is going to be friendly to low-income or non-conforming persons that have an asset. You have an asset in the home that can be used as collateral. Oftentimes people have lived in these homes for generations, but may not be able to get access to it for a number of different reasons. And so the work that we do at NLS, we're a nonprofit law firm that supports neighborhoods. And so we partner with Legal Aid. If there's an issue with title, you know, Legal Aid can help them clear up the title. We do the litigation work that's necessary to help, you know, acquire properties that are vacant and abandoned. But in addition to the work that we do in Likens, we have a rehab component where we work with the neighborhood association to be able to proactively engage residents in properties maybe next door on the same block to the properties that we're rehabbing because it improves the whole block. And so I think when you have the ability to be proactive, it makes a big difference. But the whole goal of it has to be neighborhood stabilization. It's not the house focus, it's about the community focus. And so having all these tools are extremely important when you're going in trying to make these impacts. And when we talk about being able to age in place, Marquita talked about them not being able to afford to leave. The need to retrofit housing so you can age in place. That's something that I'm not sure if there are federal dollars or state dollars available for that, but obviously there's a need because we just lost one of the best nursing homes that we had in the core closed at Swope Ridge. So you don't have really many good options to choose from if you want to stay in the city and age in place. And so that's another opportunity to look at providing funding. And so if there are any funders that are watching or listening, we keep talking about the needs, but we need to have a commitment of dollars to help make these things happen to be able to address these needs.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from you lovely people out there? Any closing comments from our
Yeah,
panelists?
so I guess the one last final thing I would bring to this conversation is we are talking about housing and the Black community. Something that I am very passionate about in the work that I do is closing the gap for disparity for Black men who are homeless. Our system, both systemically, racially, and our justice system has not done them right. For numerous reasons, I probably could be here all day too as well, we could talk about the level of access that our Black men in the community do not get, whether it be at social service providers, whether it be second chances, whether it be showing up in spaces with maybe a blemished record and having an opportunity to try it again. And so I just want to elevate that as we talk about housing in the Black community. I was a single mother of 2 children. It was not a struggle for me to get housing. We knew that if I showed up somewhere with my 2 kids, that someone was going to give me somewhere to stay or say, oh, you need a place to go. For the Black man, that does not exist. For the single dad, that does not exist. For the guy who unjustly left the prison system, that does not exist. And so we've got to raise that narrative of how we will address Black male homelessness, but how we will also address the systemic issues that keep our Black men without housing.
I'll just say amen to what you just said.
Well, that was heavy, and I think as we talk about kind of like who's impacted in these conversations and who's left out of the dialogue, I mean, this panel is of Black women, and we're all varying degrees of education and experience in our engagement in community. And I think that to the extent that we're able to raise the issues of those other disadvantaged communities is extremely important. But again, we have to change the narrative around Black men showing up with criminal records, those that have, are entrepreneurs and have, non-traditional forms of income, for those that may not otherwise be credit-worthy and their ability to be owners. There's no one-size-fit-all when we're having these discussions. There are a number of different challenges that have to be overcome, but what's important is that we have a commitment to stabilizing community and a commitment to affirming fair housing and affirming affordable housing in this city, and we begin to work together on providing solutions for those that are seeking it and having that need. Because to know that 80% of our community is either house poor or don't have access to safe and affordable housing is problematic, and it's everybody's problem. And so I look forward to continuing this conversation with the stakeholders in this room, and continuing the work that we're doing at NLS, Neighborhood Legal Support, in other communities, because as Ivanhoe was a model, we're looking to bring our tools to other neighborhoods to be a model on how we're able to address the blight and add housing stock to communities as well.
I just want to end with two things. One, emphasizing the importance of collaborating. Within a neighborhood and neighborhoods collaborating, sharing information, working together, because the more we can work together, the more likely that we're going to achieve success a little more, I won't say quickly because that's probably not the right word, but a little sooner. The other thing is, just want to say thank you to all of you who are here. I don't think I've ever been on a panel in the past where everyone seemed to be so attentive. And so thank you, and I'm sure that each of us, if we could be of any assistance, and we have many, many stories, more that we could tell, we're available, we're willing to be of assistance if needed. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Ms. May's thank you to you all for engaging in this, what's for us at Health Forward a learning exercise, as we're sort of embarking and entering into this space. We have a lot to learn from these living legends, but also from you all. And so know that we're here, that we're interested, that we're leaning in, and that we're looking for how we can best occupy space and support. And so we're here trying to figure out how best to expend our dollars to increase access to safe, quality, and affordable housing toward the end of homeownership. But it'll be a process for us, and so in that process, just hoping that we can be in thought partnership together, and just how fortunate we are to have folks, from our communities who stay in our communities and have devoted their professional lives in our communities, as I know many of you all have as well. So just thank you, thank you, thank you.